Hello, and welcome to the Body Fusion Therapy Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Heather Demirci. I actually got the idea for this episode when a listener and a patient contacted me and asked if all gymnasts stand in this anterior pelvic tilt or kind of get this huge arch in their low back. And it got me thinking that, yes, there's a lot of different posturing that athletes take based on the demands of their sport. And that doesn't always mean that it's a good thing. Sometimes it leads to degradation of the tissues and kind of leads to these general injuries that are more kind of stereotypical injuries that these athletes might undergo. So as the Tokyo 2020 Summer Olympics are going on, even though it's 2021, I wanted to talk about some of the different sports and what kind of posture you see the athletes being in and what kind of common injuries that they go through by reaching these high demands of their sports. So that's what today's episode is going to be about. It's just kind of having some fun looking at some of the different athletic endeavors that is going on right now with the Summer Olympics and what kind of are those characteristic hallmarks of those athletes and their common injuries that they might be undergoing. Let's start with gymnastics. That was the kind of basis of this whole question, the idea for this episode. So gymnasts, women more than men, but men also have the same issue, is they get this big sway in their low back. And that's caused from tilting the pelvis forward or kind of sticking their butt back a little bit. And that comes mostly because of the demands of the sport and how much extension they need to be doing, and especially with all the flips and twists and turns that they're putting their bodies through. It just kind of leads to this positioning through their low back. There's also the artistic flair of gymnastics where their arms are at the end shooting up into the air and they're going into extension as their kind of way to show that the routine is done and to pay respect to the crowd and to the judges. Now, that's not necessarily great if you stay stuck in that posture. And this is what I see happen with a lot of dancers too, that kind of go into this extension, is that the posture that they're having to go into to perform their sport or their activity kind of becomes their posture at all times. And it's not efficient. It's not the way that your body should be functioning. That big sway in your low back, if you remember back to my standing posture talk, it's not efficient. You're not going to be using your core muscles exactly right. So you'll see a lot of gymnasts or kind of people into acrobatics that they'll have this big sway in their low back. And it usually leads to what we call a spondylosis or spondylolisthesis, which basically means that one of their lumbar segments actually pushes forward. That's kind of lost the stability and is shoved forward. And that's the most common injury that I see in dancers or gymnasts or people that kind of do tumbling things, is the kind of spondylosis or spondylolisthesis in more severe cases. Spondylosis is less severe. Spondylolisthesis is definitely more severe. That could lead to actually having to have a spinal fusion. So a gymnast or a dancer, you'll definitely see that they're just really like intensely shoulders back, chest up, and big round in their low back. Not efficient. It's usually showing a sign of dysfunction elsewhere in their body. So beware of that. I understand that there are demands of your sport and that you need to kind of hold this posture. I work a lot with ballerinas, professional ballerinas, and they kind of always hold themselves in this upright posture. And I'm like, that's great. You can do that on stage. Let's see where you're lifting from to kind of lift up your carriage. But when you get off stage, I need you to be able to go back to that efficient posturing. There's things that we do, demands we put on our bodies to do the activities that we want to that aren't necessarily great. So you need to learn how to get out of it as well and not always stay stuck in that position. So gymnasts, the hallmark of a gymnast is that big sway in their low back. And that is something that you have to fight against when you're dealing with stuff. So majority of gymnasts, the ones that I have seen, they have low back issues. And it's usually because of this kind of tilting of the pelvis and the pressure that it puts on the lumbar spine. Because if you think about it, that sacrum, that's what kind of is right above the gluteal cleft, or what we might call the butt crack. And that's right above that sacrum is right above that area. And if you have it so tilted forward, you're putting so much pressure on your lumbar spine. It's taking and pushing everything forward. So it's got to take an immense amount of core strength to be able to hold those segments in and not slip forward. So usually when I'm seeing gymnasts, it's either really early in their career or late in their career. Early in their career is that they haven't built up the stability yet to be able to have that range of motion, but be able to hold a nice stable position of their spine. And then I see them later in their career where it's just they're not having the muscle mass that they used to have. They don't have the strength that they used to be able to have to hold those spinal segments into place. So it's usually beginning of their career, later in their career that we see it. But the important thing is go back into proper posturing. So those are the gymnasts. Let's go into the swimmers, something that I know very well. And something that you might not always understand when you see a swimmer. I can see a swimmer from a mile away. And it's not just the broad shoulders, right? That is one of the hallmarks, is the really wide shoulders as a swimmer. But they actually have very flat spines. So they actually have the opposite issue of the gymnasts, where their spine has very little curvature. And why is that? Well, they need to be as hydrodynamic as possible. So they need to go as fast through the water. And what's going to be faster for the water? A speeding bullet that is a straight line rather than kind of a zigzag line where you can have different flows of the water. It's going to make more drag. So you're not going to be as fast in the water. So swimmers really work at actually tucking their pelvis the other direction than the gymnast, tucking it under to make their lumbar spine as flat as possible. And even their neck too, like you're always trained to tuck your neck in and kind of retract your chin to keep that nice tight line. Now, this is great to be able to get your core to fire. Swimmers have really strong core muscles, and like true core muscles, not the fake core muscles. They have really strong core muscles, but the hard thing is that you're not meant to be so straight when you're out and walking. When you're in a weightless position of being in water, yeah, you can kind of contort your spine to be this really flat line. But when you're walking through life, you need to have a little bit more of a curvature through your spine naturally. There's got to be a little bit of flexing and giving. And swimmers are much more stiff when they're walking. The issues that swimmers more deal with, though, is you'll see those broad shoulders and they're rounded forward. They're crazy rounded forward. But if you were to look at how the position of their spine, taking out the shoulder blades, not focusing on what's happening with the shoulders, you would see their spine is still extremely straight, but their shoulders are tipped forward. It looks like they have rounded shoulders, but they actually don't. It's just that shoulder blades are rounded forward, but there's not a huge change to the actual rib cage position. Now, this happens because of the amount of work that the arms are having to do when you're swimming. The amount of revolutions that a professional swimmer does in a week is astronomical of their shoulders, and they're putting them in range of motions that aren't always the most efficient. It's putting a lot of strain on the nerves. If you remember, I talk about the nerves a lot because they're extremely important. Back to that hierarchy of the organ systems. The nerves go, for the arms, all the way from the neck down into the fingers. So they go that whole length. And swimmers are asking really a lot of tension through their arms to be able to do the motions. For butterfly, for backstroke, for breaststroke, for freestyle. It's kind of this abnormal posturing of the arms that's putting a lot of tension through the nerves. And so the reason why I think you see a lot of swimmers that their shoulders are rounded forward is because those nerves are trying to decrease the amount of length that they have to go through, that they've kind of gotten pulled so much from the swimming stroke that the only way that those nerves can kind of get a break, because it's hard for them to get a break from the elbows or for the wrist. You can't make as much changes as you're walking through life. What it can do is it can roll the shoulder forward. And by rolling that shoulder forward, where those nerves are going underneath the collarbone and into the armpit and down into the arm, it's kind of decreasing the length that the nerves have to go. So a lot of swimmers have shoulder issues. And I have found over and over again, and this was an issue actually for myself as a competitive swimmer, was that my dura, that saran wrap around the entire nervous system, was actually too tight. And so to compensate, what my shoulder would do is go in all these weird directions and really kind of push up and cause an impingement syndrome, because the only way that it could get me to do that motion that I needed to in swimming with keeping my arms straight was by making weird motions of the shoulder to take pressure off the nerves. because the nerves are going to protect themselves first and foremost. And so I found a lot of swimmers that have this multi-directional instability of their shoulder, or they have impingement syndrome. It's actually freeing up the dura around the nerves as it goes down the arm of the 3 major nerves that makes it so that the shoulder can actually do the move in the range of motion that it's supposed to, that it's meant to, and not having to compensate. So you'll see a lot of swimmers with these rounded shoulders when they're walking around because they're just trying to take a little tension off those nerves because they've just kind of been beaten up and stretched way too much while they've been swimming. So swimmers, they've got really straight spines. Not for the best. It makes them a little stiff. It makes it a little hard and they don't have great mobility later in life. And then their shoulders, though, are having to round forward to take pressure off the nerves, and it leads to shoulder issues down the road. The most common injury you see with swimmers is shoulders. And it's not all about strengthening your internal and external rotator cuffs. It's not about strengthening those muscles that's going to get you out of pain. It's about trying to find that root cause. And for a lot of swimmers, I think that root cause is actually neural tension. So those are the swimmers. Let's talk about the runners. Track and field. Track and field. If you're a good track and field athlete, you probably have a very efficient core. I've talked about this. You just really have to have everything functioning because unlike swimmers that are doing it in a weightless scenario where they're having to change the position of their spine, runners are doing it in a weight-bearing position against gravity. They are having to fight gravity as they're moving through. And so they actually have really efficient cores usually. What they do struggle with are hamstring tears. So this is something that happens over and over again with runners. And I believe a lot of it is also coming back to neural tension and that dura around that sciatic nerve. We've all heard about sciatica, right? Anybody that kind of grabs their butt in pain, they're like, oh, it's my sciatica. So that sciatic nerve that's going down in between the hamstring muscles, it has a lot of tension because they're working out those muscles so much. And as you work out muscles to build new muscle, you actually break down the old muscle. And with that can come adhesions as this whole kind of breaking down and rebuilding process that occurs when you're building muscle. That can lead to adhesions. And so that dura around the sciatic nerve gets a little caught. And so I find a lot of hamstring injuries in runners actually are due to issues with their neural tension through their sciatic nerve. And some of that can be pelvis position too. I've had a lot of runners, depending on what their position or what their event is, where they've had falls and they might have collided with other runners on the track, or, if they're cross-country runners, same thing's kind of out on the pathway. They might have collided with somebody and fallen on their bottom, and that could affect, or fallen on their side, and that can affect the alignment of their coccyx or their tailbone. And that alignment of their tailbone is actually going to affect how the pelvis is aligned, and then how the tension is on that sciatic nerve, because that tailbone, if you remember from past episodes, it's a keystone structure of the body, and that tailbone has 27 different fascial connections onto it. One of it being the dura. So that whole ceramic for the entire nervous system is attached onto the tailbone. So if the tailbone is out of place because of falls, either directly onto it or even just falling onto your side can cause a shearing motion of that tailbone, then that will cause tension onto the sciatic nerve, because you also have ligaments attaching onto that. There's a whole bunch, 27 different fascial connections onto that tailbone. That is a lot. So if that tailbone is off at all, that will cause tension through that sciatic nerve, which is going to cause tension on the hamstrings, because like the swimmers, the nerves are trying to protect themselves first and foremost. So they'll come up with different ways and different injuries that will protect the nerves. So for runners, they have hamstring injuries and they pull their hamstring, but it's the underlying cause of it is more of this neural tension through the sciatic nerve and potentially the position of their pelvis. Now, hurdlers definitely go through this. Hurdlers, especially with their lead leg, whatever one's going out straight, you have to have immense amounts of mobility through that nerve, but then also as your pelvis is moving as well, it needs to be moving efficiently. So the biggest thing for runners is the pelvis, but really that sciatic nerve mobility kind of dictates a lot of the injuries that I've seen with track and field athletes. All right, so we've done gymnasts, we've done swimmers, we've done runners. So let's talk about some other kind of smaller sports. You have crew rowing. So I went to school in Boston, and the Head of the Charles is a huge race, and I had actually roomed with a bunch of people on the crew team. So I know crew rowers very well. And crew people are usually very tall, especially the men. You want to have long wingspans so you can really pull that oar back as far as you can. You can always tell a crew rower because they are so hunched over. They're really tall and lengthy, but they're really hunched over and through their spine. And usually one side of their spine is really overdeveloped. And that depends on which side of the oar the boat is on, the position that they sit in. So there's a lot of asymmetries that happen with rowers. Rowers have this kind of abnormal pull for one side, unless they're just doing single or double where they're rowing on both sides. But usually there's still one side that's a little lower and there's just this imbalance. So you'll see a lot of mid to low back injuries in crew rowers because of this abnormal pull and tension and how they're asking so much more of one side of their back than the other side of their back, and how they're all kind of bending forward. They don't have great mobility through their lower lumbar spines. They're not staying as flat. They're kind of really rounding to be able to grab that water and pull back. So you're going to see a lot of mid to lower back injuries with rowers, and it's really trying to figure out that imbalance of the sides of the back extensors of how to make it so you even it out a little bit more and it's not this abnormal pulling that can be occurring and shifting and rotating the segments. So that are crew or rowers. How about equestrians? So I grew up also riding horses. I rode Western though, I didn't ride English. And what you'll find with equestrian riders is that they often have TL junction pain, or where the thoracic spine meets their lumbar spine. So kind of at the base of the ribs, they'll have a lot of dysfunction there, especially if they're riding English and all that posting going up and back and up and back. If you watch where usually that rotation and motion's coming from, unless they're really efficient, it's kind of coming from that one area where they're just getting so much more mobility at the base of that rib cage as they go up and down on the horse. And so you'll find a lot with the equestrian riders, while they also stand up very tall and they have a little bit of that anterior pelvic rotation, you'll see that thoracic block, if you remember the posture talks we've done, the thoracic block is behind the pelvic block, and it's kind of in a little bit of extension in through there. And so a lot of that compression they're taking as the horse is going faster into kind of a trot and a canter is that they're taking all of that force right in through that TL junction, a thoracic lumbar junction. So that's kind of the issues you find with equestrians. With divers, wrist injuries. I think that's not a big surprise that there's a lot of wrist and shoulder injuries that can occur in diving. They also deal with hamstring strains as well because of having to stay in those tucked pike positions. They can have issues there, but a lot of wrist and kind of elbow, especially if they do more high dive, like do the platform diving, you're going to have them with a lot more just compression injuries through the wrist. I mean, there's a reason why they wear those wrist guards. Volleyball players, kind of the same goes for beach volleyball and hard court or indoor volleyball. They have issues with their necks. So if you see the position they always have to kind of get into when they're ready to serve the ball over, have the ball served over to them, is they're in this bent over position in the kind of hip hinge through their pelvis, but then they're looking upwards. And so I see a lot of neck and mid thoracic injuries in volleyball players. They kind of always have this really far forward head position. And I get it because they're bending forward when they're looking up. And so it's got to come from somewhere, right? And so usually, especially as they get tired through the end of the match, you can see that they'll put their hands onto their knees to kind of rest, and they're just pushing up through their shoulders, and then their heads are just kind of sinking down and forward to look up. So you'll see a lot of volleyball players with this forward head position. And that's going to lead to also shoulder injuries because their head's not in a great position. So the scapular muscles, the muscles going to their shoulder blade, they're coming from their spine. They're not exactly where they're supposed to be. They're stretched too far. So you'll have a lot of shoulder and kind of neck injuries with your volleyball players. I don't see as much low back. It depends. Sometimes they will it if they kind of if they're an outside hitter and they don't have a great setter that's putting the ball where they should, and they're almost having to extend too far back to make contact with the ball. Then I'll see more low back pain with volleyball players. But usually if they have, a good partner that is setting to them in a good place, it's not as much low back as it is more shoulder and neck injury. So you can always tell volleyball players, because they're also usually very tall and they always kind of have that forward head posturing going on. So I would say that would be more of the dysfunctions that we see with volleyball. That covers quite a few sports that are going on right now in the Olympics. I know there's many more sports that are going on. Some of them are bigger ones that I feel like could use their own episode. Like, I know I have a lot of patients that are soccer fans and could go into soccer there too. But there's other sports out there, and I understand that, but I was just trying to give you a snippet of what I see when I see some of these athletes and the dysfunctions they have going on and the common injuries that I see. So I'm hoping that you guys are enjoying the Olympics, as strange as they are without spectators, but being able to enjoy and maybe look at things a little differently as you see it going through this next week, about how athletes are pretty kind of stereotypical sometimes and how their bodies look and the forces that are put on them. And then unfortunately, some of the injuries that they incur because of that and because of the demands of their sports. But best of luck to all of those competing in the Tokyo Olympics, and go Team USA. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Body Fusion Therapy Podcast. Please share it with your friends and family, as well as leave a review if you liked what you heard today. We're looking forward to continuing this journey of looking at the body. Tune in next time.